Fidel Castro, the leader of Cuba, survived, according to various estimates, more than 600 attempts on his life. Most involved the CIA and Cuban émigré groups trying to eliminate Castro to weaken his influence and possibly change Cuba's political course. Hi friends, in this video, we will tell you how the CIA and other organizations tried to get rid of the leader of Cuba and how he managed to escape danger. How Fidel managed to come to power in Cuba and how he was helped from Mexico and the US. We will also learn how Fidel Castro financed his revolution. Fidel Castro was known for his love of cigars, especially Cuban brands like Cohiba, created especially for him in the 1960s. At the peak of the craze, he smoked several cigars a day. However, in 1985, as part of a campaign for health and an example for the nation, Castro announced that he had given up smoking completely. From then on, he publicly did not smoke and even encouraged Cubans to quit the habit. One of the first conspiracies organized by the CIA involved the use of a poisoned cigar. The CIA planned to send Castro a cigar filled with botulinum toxin, but the plan failed to materialize. Fidel Castro was into scuba diving because of his interest in the sea, nature, and adventure. For him, diving underwater was a way to relax and take his mind off his busy political life. Also, as a high-energy person, he loved physical activity, and diving offered him the opportunity to explore the underwater world, stay fit, and at the same time find harmony in the silence of the underwater depths. One of his favorite diving regions was Playa Girón in the Bay of Pigs. Not only is the area rich in marine life and coral reefs, but it also holds special significance to Cubans because of the events of 1961, when the US made an unsuccessful attempt to land there. Castro often went diving in the waters of the Bay of Pigs and other popular Cuban resorts, such as Maria La Gorda on the west coast and Guadalavaca in the east. The CIA knew of Castro's passion, and they prepared a special diving suit infected with a fungus capable of causing deadly skin and respiratory diseases. Nevertheless, Fidel refused the gift when he suspected something amiss. One of the most dramatic attempts on Fidel Castro's life involved Marita Lorenz, Castro's former girlfriend, who was recruited by the CIA to assassinate him. And before we tell this dramatic attempted assassination attempt on Fidel, in which a former girlfriend took part, we will go back to the moment of their acquaintance. We will learn how Fidel Castro came to power, because their acquaintance took place in this period. We will also learn why Marita Lorenz agreed to assassinate Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro and his brother Raúl came from a fairly well-to-do family. Their father, Angel Castro, was the owner of a large sugarcane plantation. His father was a Spanish immigrant from Galicia who moved to Cuba in the late 19th century. His mother, Lina Ruz González, was Cuban and worked on Angel's plantation as a maid. They later married and had several children, including Fidel and his younger brother Raúl. Lina played an important role in Fidel's life and supported him over the years. Fidel Castro received a good education, which played an important role in his political career and shaping his views. Castro began studying at private Jesuit schools such as Colegio La Salle and Colegio Dolores in Santiago de Cuba. From the beginning, he showed himself as an intelligent but irascible and unruly student. Castro later enrolled at the prestigious Jesuit school Colegio de Belén in Havana, where he received an excellent liberal arts education. This is where his teachers noticed his leadership qualities and intellectual abilities. After graduating from high school, Castro enrolled in law school at the University of Havana. At university, he became active in the political life of the country and advocated for the rights of the poor. In 1950, Castro earned a law degree and began working as an attorney helping the poor. Castro's education, background, and the influence of his parents shaped him as a person and contributed to his desire to fight for social justice in Cuba. He saw the corruption and brutality of power and looked for ways to make a difference for the poor. While still a university student, Fidel was politically active and joined the Organization of Cuban Students. Fidel's first political views were shaped by his university life, where he encountered left-wing ideas. Castro supported the ideas of nationalism and was against US influence on Cuba's economy and politics, believing it hindered the country's development. In 1952, Fidel Castro ran for the Cuban parliament from the Ortodoxos party and hoped for a democratic victory. However, the elections never took place. A few months before, General Fulgencio Batista staged a military coup, overthrew the government and established a dictatorship. This coup was a turning point for Castro. He realized that change could not be achieved democratically. Castro came to the conclusion that overthrowing the Batista dictatorship could only be achieved by armed struggle and began to consider radical methods to achieve his goals. In 1953, Castro gathered like-minded people and organized an armed rebellion against Batista. On July 26, 1953, he and his supporters attempted to seize the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba in order to obtain weapons and start an uprising. However, the uprising failed. Most of the participants were killed or arrested, and Castro himself was taken into custody and sentenced to 15 years in prison. At the trial, he gave his famous "History Will Vindicate Me" speech, in which he outlined his ideas of social justice and Cuban independence. In 1955, after 2 years in prison, Castro was released under amnesty, the result of public pressure. After his release, he emigrated to Mexico, where he began preparations for a new revolutionary struggle and founded the 26th of July movement. Although Fidel was not free to use family money, some family resources and connections helped in organizing the initial stages of the movement. There was a significant Cuban emigrant community in the US, especially in Miami, many of whose members were dissatisfied with the Batista regime and supported Castro's ideas for a change of power. These emigrants provided financial and logistical support to the revolutionaries. Cuban emigrants raised money to buy weapons, vehicles, and equipment, and helped the revolutionaries with transportation arrangements to Cuba. In Mexico, where Castro was in exile and preparing for a new attempt to seize power, he met sympathetic representatives of leftist political movements. Supporters of the revolution collected donations, organized meetings, and helped with transportation and shelter for the revolutionaries. In Mexico, he met Ernesto Che Guevara, with whom he quickly became friends and who became an important associate of Castro. Latin American supporters, especially students and activists, also helped through their networks, spreading the message of the Cuban Revolution and providing moral support. They began to prepare an armed insurrection and trained for future guerrilla warfare. In December 1956, Castro and his supporters landed in Cuba and took refuge in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, from where they began a guerrilla war against Batista's army. During the guerrilla war in the Sierra Maestra, Castro and his forces often seized weapons, supplies, and funds from Batista government forces. This helped to maintain the armament of the Revolutionary Army and keep ammunition stockpiled without significant waste. Some leftist and communist movements in Latin America and elsewhere also assisted Castro with finances, resources, and political support. These groups saw him as a potential ally in the struggle against capitalist regimes and Western influence. Over the next few years, Castro and his men, using guerrilla tactics, gathered support among the peasantry and working class, organized a propaganda campaign, and recruited more followers. With each passing year, they gained strength and influence. In late 1958, revolutionaries began occupying major cities, and on January 1, 1959, Batista fled the country. Fidel Castro and his army entered Havana, proclaiming the victory of the revolution and beginning the building of a new nation. Thus, Fidel Castro's transition from advocacy to revolutionary activity was gradual and the result of disillusionment with the possibilities of a peaceful political path. Castro, seeing the injustice and corruption of the Batista dictatorship, concluded that the only solution was revolution to create an independent and just Cuba. Fidel Castro and his supporters were against capitalist regimes, particularly the Fulgencio Batista regime in Cuba, because of a combination of factors related to inequality, resource exploitation, foreign influence, and social injustice. The capitalist system that dominated Cuba before the revolution led to dramatic social inequalities. Most of the wealth and resources belonged to a small layer of Cuban elites and foreign companies, mostly American, while many Cubans remained in poverty. Castro and his supporters saw that much of the population lived in poverty, without access to education, healthcare, or decent jobs. They believed that capitalism only exacerbated these problems by making the rich even richer and the poor even poorer. US companies controlled much of Cuba's economy, including sugar plantations, energy companies, railroads, and other key industries. This created Cuba's dependence on the US and deprived the country of economic sovereignty. Castro and his supporters believed that capitalism favored foreign domination, which caused Cuba to lose control of its natural resources. Castro's anti-capitalist stance was aimed at gaining independence from outside influence. But when Fidel Castro came to power, he led the country to total dependence on the Soviet Union, which also did not help Cuba's development. And when the Soviet Union broke up into many independent states in 1991, Cuba experienced its greatest depression. Castro and his associates were inspired by the ideas of Marxism and socialism, which aimed to establish social justice and eliminate the exploitation of workers. They believed that only socialism could provide equality and access to resources for all, not just the rich and privileged. But the experience of the Soviet Union has shown that the idea of Marxism and socialism does not provide social justice and does not contribute to the development of the country, but on the contrary, destroys it. There is not a single successful country with the ideology of socialism. Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, have a hybrid system. These countries are often cited as examples of successful combinations of social programs with market economies. Scandinavian countries have implemented free education, affordable healthcare, generous social benefits, support labor unions, and provide a high standard of living. At the same time, they have a developed private sector and a strong market economy, which allows them to generate sufficient revenues to finance social programs. This combination is called social democracy and is an example of how social guidelines can be introduced without abandoning the market economy. Castro sought a system that provided free education, medicine, and housing, which contradicted the ideas of capitalism and its emphasis on private property and profit. Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and other revolutionary leaders were inspired by Marxist ideas and the experiences of other leftist revolutions, such as the Russian Revolution. They believed that capitalism was an oppressive system, and that the transition to socialism would be a step toward freedom and equality for all people. Che Guevara and other associates saw Cuba as part of the global struggle against imperialism and capitalism. They wanted to free Cuba from this influence and believed that the revolution would be an example for other Latin American countries. Although a few decades later, Augusto Pinochet chose the opposite model of development for Chile. Chile is a country of owners, not proletarians, Pinochet never tired of repeating. A group of Chilean economists, many of whom had studied in Chicago under Nobel laureate Professor Friedman and Professor Arnold Harberger, formed around him. They developed a program of transition to a free market economy for Chile. Pinochet has been criticized for human rights abuses and repression, but at the same time his economic policies are recognized by some experts as successful. Thus, political scientists and economists Robert Pakenham and William Ratliff of the Hoover Institution assess Pinochet's economic policies as follows. The first country in the world to make a decisive break with the past, from socialism and extreme state capitalism to market-oriented policies and state structures, was not China, not Britain under Margaret Thatcher in the late 1970s, not the United States under Reagan in 1981, and not any other country in Latin America. That country was Pinochet's Chile in 1975. Chile is one of the most economically and socially stable nations in South America, leading Latin America in rankings of economic competitiveness, per capita income, globalization, peacefulness index, and economic freedom. Fidel Castro and his supporters were against capitalism because they saw it as a system that supported inequality, dependence on foreign interests, and corruption. Instead, they sought a socialist state based on the principles of social justice, equality, and independence. Fidel Castro was 32 years old when he came to power in Cuba on January 1, 1959. He was born on August 13, 1926, and the victory of the Cuban Revolution and the overthrow of the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista occurred in January 1959. And just a month later, he met Marita Lorenz. Her father, Heinrich Lorenz, was captain of the German cruise ship Berlin, and when the ship docked in Havana, Castro himself and a guard came aboard. An affair began between them, and soon Marita moved to Cuba and began living with Castro. However, their relationship ended tragically. Marita became pregnant by Fidel, but, as she herself claims, was forcibly subjected to an abortion allegedly arranged by the Cuban authorities without her consent. This loss left a deep mark on her soul and was the reason for her departure from Cuba and the breakdown of her relationship. Sometime later, the CIA recruited Lorenz to participate in an assassination attempt on Castro. According to her, she was given poison capsules to kill Fidel, but when she met him again, she was unable to complete the task. Lorenz claims Castro guessed her intentions. He simply handed her his gun and offered to kill him. This moment, she recalls, finally broke her will and she abandoned the mission. But despite all the conspiracies, the secret to Castro's survival was his instinct and awareness. He changed routes often, surrounded himself with trusted people, and was always on guard. Some believe his defenses were almost magical. Fidel Castro often commented humorously on these attempts, calling his survivability a kind of divine protection. In the end, Fidel Castro died a natural death on November 25, 2016, at the age of 90. After hundreds of assassination attempts and decades of ruling Cuba, he left, leaving a mark on history and changing his country forever.